Have you ever wondered what would happen if fate threw a challenge your way and the very person you least expected stepped up to save you? In this incredible story, a young boy who's been the target of cruel mockery and prejudice is the one who ends up saving a life against all odds. What happens next is nothing short of extraordinary. The world is full of unexpected moments, those rare instances where fate tests the very limits of our beliefs, forcing us to see people in a different light. But have you ever wondered what would happen if the very person you least expected became the one who saved you? In this incredible story, a young boy, a child mocked and dismissed, becomes the hero no one saw coming. What happens next is nothing short of extraordinary. The towering glass structure of the Regent Corporate Tower gleamed under the afternoon sun, its polished steel reflecting the prestige of those who walked through its halls. It was a place of power, where high-ranking executives made million-dollar decisions over morning coffee, where wealth and status dictated who mattered and who did not. Every surface inside was pristine, from the marble floors to the stainless steel elevators that glided smoothly between the upper levels, ferrying the elite to their offices. Among them was Margaret Whitmore, a high-ranking executive who carried herself with an air of superiority. She had spent years perfecting the art of dismissing those she deemed beneath her, believing that power was meant for a select few. The people who cleaned the floors, the ones who fetched coffee, the nameless employees who worked behind the scenes to keep everything running, they were nothing more than background noise to her. And then there was the boy. He was just 10 years old, far too young to be working in a place like this. But life had never given him a choice. A janitor's uniform, 2 sizes too big, hung loosely from his small frame. His dark eyes, filled with an understanding far beyond his years, remained focused on the mop in his hands as he moved across the floor with quiet determination. He had learned long ago that in places like this, it was better to be invisible. The executives walked past him without a glance, their polished shoes clicking against the tiles he worked so hard to keep clean. He had grown used to the stares, the whispers, the careless way people treated him. But some, like Margaret Whitmore, did not even bother with subtlety. She approached the elevator with her usual commanding presence, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her designer bag rested on her arm, her phone pressed to her ear, as she spoke in clipped, dismissive tones. And then, as she passed the boy, she paused just long enough to sneer. "They'll let just about anyone in this building these days, won't they?" She muttered under her breath, her words carrying the unmistakable edge of disdain. The boy froze, gripping the mop a little tighter. He had heard worse before. People like her didn't need to shout to make their cruelty known. It was in the way they looked at him, the way their lips curled in disgust when they thought no one was watching. It was in the way they made sure he knew he didn't belong. But he didn't react. Not outwardly. He had learned that responding only made things worse. So instead, he bowed his head and continued working. Margaret stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind her with a quiet hum. To her, this was just another day, another moment where she had the power to remind someone of their place, another instance where she walked past someone who did not matter. What she did not know was that in a few moments, everything would change, and the boy she had just dismissed would become the only person standing between her and death. The boy had learned from an early age that life was not fair. He had grown up in a world that demanded twice the effort for half the reward, where every step forward was met with resistance. His mother worked long hours as a housekeeper, her hands calloused from scrubbing floors that would never belong to her. His father had once been a proud man, but years of doors closing in his face had left him weary, his spirit worn thin by the weight of rejection. Despite their struggles, the boy was raised to believe in dignity, in hard work, and in the quiet kind of strength that came from perseverance. His parents had instilled in him the idea that no job was beneath him, that taking pride in his work, no matter what it was what truly mattered. So, when the opportunity came to work as a janitor in one of the most prestigious buildings in the city, he took it without hesitation. He was the youngest among the cleaning staff, and while the others often saw him as just a kid, he worked just as hard as they did, if not harder. Every morning before school and every evening after, he mopped floors, emptied trash cans, and polished the very elevators that carried men and women in power to their offices. It was exhausting, but he never complained. He knew that every dollar he earned helped put food on the table, that every shift he worked brought him one step closer to the dreams he kept tucked away in his heart. But no amount of hard work could change the way some people looked at him. He had seen it in their eyes, the way their expressions tightened when they saw him in the hallway, the way their lips curled in distaste when he walked past. Some did not even try to hide their disdain, making it clear that they believed he did not belong in the same space as them. Others, like Margaret Whitmore, made sure he knew exactly where they thought his place was. She was one of the most powerful executives in the company, a woman who had built her success on sharp business acumen and an even sharper tongue. She was ruthless in the boardroom, feared by colleagues, and respected for her ability to close deals effortlessly. But her power had also made her arrogant, her wealth reinforcing the belief that she was superior to those who served her. People like the boy were nothing more than an afterthought to her. To her, he was just another worker, part of the machinery that kept the building running, a faceless, nameless presence that did not deserve acknowledgement. She barely glanced at him when she passed, as if even looking in his direction was beneath her. And when she did acknowledge him, it was never with kindness. She made no effort to hide her disdain, making cruel remarks under her breath whenever she walked by. "Try not to leave streaks on the floor. I don't need to be slipping because of your incompetence. If you worked as hard at school as you do scrubbing floors, maybe you'd be doing something worthwhile." She never expected a response, nor did she care if her words cut deep. It was not about him. It was about reinforcing her own sense of superiority. In her world, there were people who mattered and people who did not, and in her eyes, he would always be the latter. But the boy never reacted. He had learned to endure, to keep his head down and his emotions buried. Responding would only give her satisfaction, and he refused to give her that power. He knew that his time would come, that one day he would prove to people like her that worth was not measured by wealth, but by character. Until then, he worked in silence, letting his actions speak louder than any insult ever could. Margaret Whitmore, however, never imagined that the very boy she ridiculed would one day be the reason she lived to see another morning. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the lavish interior lined with gold trim and sleek paneling. The lighting inside was warm, almost artificial in its perfection, casting a glow on the high-powered executives who used it daily. Margaret Whitmore stepped inside with her usual air of superiority, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she adjusted the expensive watch on her wrist. She had just finished an important meeting and was already thinking about the next one, barely registering the presence of the janitor standing quietly near the back of the elevator. Her gaze flicked toward him, and the familiar wave of irritation crossed her face. Even in the confines of this luxury, there he was, a reminder of the people she considered beneath her. With a smirk curling at the edges of her lips, she let out a small, condescending laugh. "Still wasting your time mopping floors, huh?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "I suppose we all have our place in life, don't we?" The boy's grip tightened on the mop handle he had been holding, his knuckles turning white for just a moment. The words stung, just like they always did, but he forced himself to remain still. He had learned long ago that responding would accomplish nothing. People like Margaret Whitmore would never listen, never understand. He kept his head down, focusing on the numbers glowing above the elevator doors as they ascended, willing himself to ignore the sharp edge in her voice. The number 27 lit up, then 28. Then, suddenly, a violent jolt rocked the elevator. The entire cabin shuddered, the smooth hum of its ascent replaced by the terrifying groan of metal under stress. Margaret let out a startled gasp, her polished confidence evaporating as she gripped the handrail tightly. The boy's body tensed, his heart pounding as the floor beneath them lurched downward. The lights flickered. A loud snap echoed through the confined space. Then, silence, just for a fraction of a second. And then, the elevator plunged. Margaret screamed. The boy barely had time to react as the weightless sensation of freefall overtook them. The polished world of luxury was gone in an instant, replaced by sheer terror. The walls vibrated violently, the emergency alarm blaring as sparks exploded from the flickering lights above. The cables groaned in protest, and the sensation of dropping faster and faster sent Margaret into a panic. "No, no, no," she choked out, desperately slamming her hands against the control panel. The buttons flashed red, but nothing responded. The emergency brakes failed. The elevator continued to plummet. Margaret stumbled, her expensive heels slipping against the floor. Her hands reached for the side railing, but the sudden motion threw her forward. The boy's eyes widened as he saw it happening, the exact moment her balance gave way. Her body tilted, and before she could scream, her hand missed the railing entirely. She was falling, straight toward the gaping gap between the elevator floor and the open shaft. Without thinking, without hesitation, the boy lunged forward. His small hands grasped her wrist just as her body teetered at the edge. The weight of the sudden motion nearly yanked him forward, but he planted his feet, digging in with every ounce of strength he had. His fingers burned as he tightened his grip, his arms trembling as he fought against gravity itself. Margaret let out a piercing scream, her body dangling precariously over the dark abyss below. "Hold on!" the boy shouted, his voice shaking but firm. His arms strained, his muscles screaming in protest, but he refused to let go. Margaret's terrified eyes locked onto his. Her perfectly polished exterior was gone, stripped away in the face of mortal danger. Her breathing was ragged, her fingers clawing at his arm as she struggled to hold on. The boy's grip never wavered. The elevator shuddered violently again, the cables whining as if they were ready to snap completely. Margaret sobbed, the fear in her eyes undeniable. For the first time she was powerless, and the only person standing between her and death was the very child she had dismissed. At that exact moment, the boy didn't hesitate. He acted. Do you think you would have been able to do the same? Imagine being in his shoes. Where are you watching from right now, and how would you have reacted? Let us know in the comments, and tell us what time it is as you follow this story unfolding before you. The weight of Margaret's body felt unbearable, her panic making her limbs stiff and heavy as she dangled over the dark abyss. The boy's fingers dug into her wrist, his muscles burning as he struggled to keep his grip. The elevator creaked beneath them, its cables groaning under the strain, as if warning them that their time was running out. He gritted his teeth, his feet firmly planted on the trembling floor, refusing to let go. With a deep breath, he pulled. His small frame shook with effort as he used every ounce of strength he had. His arms trembled, his breath came in sharp gasps, but he would not give up. He adjusted his stance, planting one foot against the elevator wall for leverage. And with a final, desperate pull, Margaret was hauled back inside. She collapsed onto the floor, gasping, her entire body trembling from the shock of what had just happened. The boy fell backward, panting heavily. His arms ached, his hands were raw, but she was safe. He had saved her. The realization settled over him slowly, but he had no time to process it. The elevator was still in free fall. The dim emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the space. Margaret clutched her chest, her breath shallow as she tried to comprehend how close she had come to death. For the first time in her life, she felt small, vulnerable, helpless. And for the first time, she truly looked at the boy. He stood there, his small shoulders rising and falling with every heavy breath, his hands still shaking from the strain of holding on to her. His janitor's uniform, too big for his thin frame, was wrinkled and stained from the dust and sweat of his efforts. But none of that mattered now. He was no longer just a faceless worker in the background, someone meant to blend into the scenery of the world she lived in. He was the reason she was still alive. Margaret tried to form words, but nothing came. The arrogance she had carried for so long had evaporated in an instant. She had spent her life looking down on people like him, convinced that their worth was tied to the menial jobs they did. She had dismissed him without a second thought, mocked him, ridiculed him. And yet, when it mattered most, when her life hung in the balance, it was not her wealth or status that had saved her. It was him. The elevator jolted again, the final emergency brakes screeching as the descent finally slowed. The impact sent them both stumbling, but this time they remained upright. The violent drop came to a stop just before the ground floor, the doors still sealed shut. They were alive, but the silence between them was heavier than the tension that had filled the elevator just minutes ago. Outside, people had gathered near the entrance of the building, alerted by the emergency alarm. Executives, office workers, and security guards stood frozen, staring at the flickering screen that showed the stalled elevator just feet above the lobby floor. Those who had seen Margaret Whitmore walk into that elevator with the boy earlier now stood in stunned silence. The last thing they had witnessed was Margaret making one of her usual cruel remarks. They had smirked, laughed under their breath, knowing it was just another moment of her reinforcing her dominance. But now, the woman who had always carried herself with untouchable superiority was inside that elevator, relying on the one person she had treated as insignificant. When the rescue team finally managed to pry open the doors, they expected to find a panicked executive and a frightened young worker. What they saw instead was something that would be talked about in hushed, astonished voices for days to come. Margaret Whitmore, usually poised and perfect, sat on the floor, her hands shaking, her gaze locked onto the boy who had saved her life, and him. He was standing tall. The people outside gasped as they watched him step forward, unscathed but visibly exhausted. The security guards rushed to help Margaret, but she barely reacted, still too stunned to speak. The other executives, the same ones who had walked past the boy 100 times without ever noticing him, now stared at him with something different in their eyes. Recognition. The janitor. The child they had never acknowledged. The one they had overlooked so effortlessly had just performed an act of bravery that none of them could have imagined. As Margaret was helped out of the elevator, her hands gripping the arms of 2 security personnel, she paused. Slowly, she turned back to look at the boy. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never experienced before: gratitude. And for the first time in his life, he was not just a boy with a mop. He was seen. The world outside the elevator was different now. The gleaming corporate lobby, once filled with people too absorbed in their own success to notice anything beyond their immediate concerns, had come to a complete standstill. The moment Margaret Whitmore stepped out, visibly shaken, flanked by security guards and paramedics, the entire building watched in stunned silence. But it was not just her they were looking at. It was him. The boy stood near the elevator, his small hands still trembling from the effort of saving her life. His janitor's uniform was wrinkled, his face streaked with sweat and dust, but his posture remained steady. He had survived. He had saved her. And now, for the first time in his life, he was no longer invisible. Margaret stood there, catching her breath, her heart still pounding in her chest. Moments ago, she had believed she was going to die. The elevator had failed, the cables had snapped, and she had been seconds away from plunging into darkness. And yet, here she was, alive, because of him. She turned toward the boy, her usual composure nowhere to be found. There was no arrogance in her expression, no trace of the dismissive sneer she had so often worn around him. Instead, her eyes softened in a way they never had before. She hesitated, her voice unsteady. The words she needed to say did not come easily. She had spent her entire life believing that wealth, power, and status defined a person's worth. But now, standing in front of the child she had ridiculed only moments before, she realized how wrong she had been. "I was wrong about you," she said finally, her voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it before. "I judged you unfairly, and I am sorry." The boy blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in her tone. Apologies were not something he had ever expected from someone like Margaret Whitmore. He had spent years enduring her cruel remarks, her dismissive attitude, and her complete disregard for people like him. And yet, in this moment, she was looking at him as though he were the most important person in the room. She took a deep breath and straightened her posture, regaining some of her composure. "You saved my life," she said, this time louder, making sure that everyone in the room heard her. "And I will never forget that." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The executives, assistants, and staff members who had spent so long following Margaret's lead now looked at her in a new light. But more importantly, they looked at the boy differently too. He was no longer just a janitor, a child they had ignored in passing. He was a hero. As news of the incident spread, the company's senior executives took immediate notice. The boy's act of bravery was the kind of story that could not be ignored. Within days, the building's management arranged a meeting with him and his family, offering something he had never imagined possible: a full scholarship to one of the best schools in the city. Margaret herself played a key role in making it happen. The same woman who had once scoffed at his presence now sat across from his mother, personally assuring her that the boy would never have to mop floors again. "This is the least we can do," she said, her tone no longer condescending, but genuine. "He deserves every opportunity we can give him." His mother, who had spent her entire life fighting to give her son a better future, wiped tears from her eyes. She had always known his worth, always believed in his strength, but now the world finally saw it too. As weeks passed, the impact of his actions continued to grow. His story spread through the building, then through the company, and eventually beyond. The management team took steps to implement diversity and inclusion programs, ensuring that employees, no matter their role, would be treated with the respect they deserved. Policies were changed, training sessions were held, and for the first time, people in the building began to acknowledge the staff they had once ignored. But beyond the policies and the public gestures, something even more profound had changed: the way people saw one another. Executives who had once walked past janitors without a second glance now offered nods of acknowledgement. Conversations that had never happened before began to take place in the hallways, bridging the divide between those who worked behind the scenes and those who sat in boardrooms. And at the heart of it all was the boy. The scholarship allowed him to leave his janitor's uniform behind, but he never forgot where he came from. He attended school with the same quiet determination he had brought to his work, knowing that his education was not just for himself, but for his family, for the people like him who had been overlooked for too long. Margaret Whitmore, once a symbol of privilege and arrogance, became one of his biggest advocates. She used her influence to mentor him, ensuring that he had the guidance he needed to navigate a world that had never been built for him. And while she would never erase the years of prejudice she had carried, she was determined to prove that change was possible. One act of bravery had changed everything. The boy had stepped up when no one else had. He had proven that courage was not about status or wealth, but about heart. And in doing so, he had not only saved a life, he had changed an entire community. The boy stepped out of the towering glass building, his feet landing firmly on the pavement as the evening air wrapped around him. The place that had once felt so vast, so untouchable, no longer seemed intimidating. He had walked into it as a nameless worker, someone who blended into the background, unnoticed and unappreciated. But now, as he looked back at the gleaming skyscraper, he saw it for what it truly was. Not an insurmountable wall, but a place he had conquered. The whispers of admiration still lingered in the halls behind him. Executives who had once passed him without a glance now spoke his name with respect. Employees who had once ignored him now looked at him with something new in their eyes: recognition. The world inside that building had shifted in ways he never imagined. But the greatest change of all had been within himself. For so long, he had believed that people like him had no place in spaces of power, that no matter how hard he worked, he would always be seen as just another invisible worker. But in a single moment of courage, that belief had shattered. He had not set out to be a hero. He had not expected to be acknowledged, let alone celebrated. He had simply done what he knew was right, without hesitation, without thinking about what he would gain. And that had made all the difference. As he walked toward the street, he thought about the scholarship offer waiting for him, the doors that had suddenly opened to a future he had never dared to dream of. The education he had always longed for was now within his grasp. His days of mopping floors were over, but the lessons they had taught him, humility, perseverance, resilience, would stay with him forever. The city lights flickered around him as he continued walking, the noise of traffic blending into the rhythm of his thoughts. He had spent years believing that the world was rigid, that people like Margaret Whitmore would always look down on people like him. But even she had changed. Even she had learned to see beyond the surface, to acknowledge the worth of a person not by their status, but by their actions. It had taken only one moment to change everything. One moment to remind the world that kindness and courage could break down the hardest walls. As he turned the corner, he allowed himself a small smile. He was not just walking away from a building. He was stepping into a new life. Because in a world where people are often judged by their status, it's the heart that truly makes a hero.